This is our teaching video for the first Sunday in Lent, entitled Desire and Dominion, and we're going to be in the garden, Genesis chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, where they get the command not to eat of the tree of good and evil, and then Genesis 3, 1 through 7, where the creatures, man and woman, do. Then we're going to go to Romans and talk about dominion of sin and death, but also then finally the promise and gift of Christ, which is a different kind of dominion, life and mercy. And not only a different kind of dominion, but one that far surpasses the effect of the first trespass. And then finally, Matthew chapter 4, 1 through 11, in the wilderness with Jesus. We know from our own history that there are places we revisit, hoping to tease out new details to give us meaning. And so on your picture, we have Dealey Plaza in Dallas, where JFK was assassinated. People continually come back to this place, review the Zapruder film, look at all sorts of details, trying to tease out new meanings of that significant event in our history. And what I want to encourage you to do is to really read carefully Genesis chapter 2 and 3, read carefully Matthew chapter 4, because these are sites of important events where if we can tease out more detail, we are able to find out a deeper significance in what's being communicated. Now, one of the things that close reading does is it allows us to see the playfulness of the text. So, for example, here are two Hebrew words that we'll see in Genesis. One is arum, one is arumim. And arumim is the word for naked. At the end of Genesis chapter 2, we hear that Adam and Eve are naked and they are not ashamed. There's a kind of primordial innocence. Arum is the Hebrew word for cunning. And so I just bring it up because the Bible delights in words that sound alike. Arum, arumim, for example. And so the nakedness connected to the cunning of the snake, and that nakedness then is transformed by the cunning of the snake. Another example is the word for apple and evil in Latin. So when we talk about the Garden of Eden, we often talk about Adam and Eve eating the apple. And one of the reasons we do that is because the word for evil and apple in Latin is the same word, just with a different pronunciation or different emphasis, malum and malum. And so we see that one way to associate the two events of eating the fruit and then the introduction of evil into the heart of God's people is the words in Latin are the same. So I encourage you to a deep reading, but I encourage you to a playful reading. And the apple's not in the text, but that then has become something that's been added, and one reason is we have this history with language. Well, looking at the text from Genesis, we have God's prohibition in chapter 2. God saying, thou shalt not. Actually, God saying, thou shalt enjoy the garden, enjoy everything in the garden, but you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree of good and evil. Now, what exactly is the tree of good and evil? Well, we have a couple different options. When God says the tree of good and evil, that could mean the tree that encompasses knowledge of everything. So good and evil accounts for everything in the world. Or it has simply the moral definition that God creates human beings as good, but evil is a reality outside of them. Evil is an experience they haven't brought into themselves. But by disobeying the commandment, that's exactly what happens. And so what does God say? God says, if you eat the tree, or if you eat the fruit of the tree, you will be dead. You will be doomed to die, says the text. Now, sometimes people say, well, that's not exactly what happens. They eat the fruit and they don't die. But if you look at the language of Genesis 2, it's actually God saying you will be sentenced to death, because that's the exact language that gets used for later legislation in the Bible when the death penalty is enacted. So think about a person who gets sentenced to death. They go to their sentencing hearing. They are sentenced to die, but they don't die in the courtroom. They're then, that's something that is a reality for the future. And so it's the same thing here. If you eat of this fruit, you will be doomed to die. You will be sentenced to death. Now we have the prohibition, and then we have the serpent. And the word for serpent here could mean almost a dragon-like character. And that's actually something I'm going to connect to at the end of the teaching video out of our class on Revelation. So stay tuned for that. So we have the serpent, and what the serpent does is the serpent has a conversation with the woman. And so we can say that both the man and the woman are equally culpable in this. Sometimes people have discussions about whose fault it is, and I'm not sure any of those discussions are productive. I mean, human beings are equally sharers of the guilt. And the serpent begins the conversation almost like saying, though God said, it's really kind of the serpent offering a clause that gets interrupted. And then what happens is the woman, Eve, says, well, actually, what God said is, and she goes through in Genesis 3, all the trees are good, but we shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, nor shall we touch it. And what I want you to notice is she's made a classic mistake, and human beings make a classic mistake, and she's added to the law. God says very clearly in the Bible, in several places, you shall neither add nor subtract to what I'm telling you. Because as human beings, all of us have the tendency to change what God says. We either subtract, take away from it, so that it doesn't mean what God said, or we add on top of it, and then it no longer means what God said. So sometimes God just says, take what I told you and leave it alone. But in this case, you'll notice she's added to the law when she says you shall not touch it, because God didn't say that. And certainly biblical commentators have noticed that maybe Adam and Eve, the man and the woman, may have touched the tree and noticed there were no negative effects and then been tempted to eat the fruit. That's just conjecture, because what we really want to talk about now is lust of the eyes. When the woman looks and sees the tree and desires it, it says she actually lusts with her eyes after it. That's the meaning of the words that are being used there. And lust of the eyes is something for you to think about during Lent. In fact, in one of John's letters, he talks about lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and just pride of life. And he says very clearly, these three things do not come from the Father, but from the world and the one who is ruler over the world, namely Satan. And so one of the temptations that you will encounter is lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life. And so when the snake is talking to the creatures, man and woman, you'll notice that he gives them something to eat, which oftentimes is lust of the flesh. He gives them something pleasing to look at, turning their desire from where it should be. And he tempts them with the words, you will be gods. You will be gods without God. And of course, this is our greatest desire. If we can be God and call the shots, this is a lot better than being a servant of God. And so notice, lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. But in the text itself, this is the explicit. I mean, these are kind of implicit. Pride of life and flesh. This one's explicit. The eyes of the creature lust and desire the fruit. And so you need to ask yourself where your eyes desire and actually turn your eyes and desire away from God. So if we imagine, here's God over here, our eyes, I'm going to draw a little eye here, are meant to gaze upon God. Notice there are lots of creatures in the apocalyptic books who are covered in eyes because they're always watching and gazing, and their eyes are always turned towards God. But if we have this object over here, I'm going to draw a little bit of an apple, a little malum here, and then we say, gosh, oh, that looks good. And notice the gaze and the desire starts to leave God and go somewhere else. This is a real spiritual danger. And that's why it's something you need to reflect on in Lent. What do your eyes look at? I mean, this is one of the problems with internet pornography, for example. Eyes that go onto the internet and start to take into the flesh and change desire, and then it changes the habits of the flesh, and it changes behavior, for example. That's just one, but you could think of others. Where is your gaze affixed to God? And are there places you shouldn't be looking? And I think that's a good Lenten question. Let me just say this. I mean, one reason we use the word lust is desire in of itself is not bad, right? I mean, if you desire something that's good, I desire my wife, or I desire the good of a friend. Desire can be very powerful, but when we desire things that are not ours, that's when we have a problem. So this lust of the eyes is tied very closely to coveting. And so think about that from the 10 Commandments. Well, we know what happens then. This is what leads to the fall. And this is what Paul talks about in Romans when he talks about the dominion of death. The dominion of death and sin. Now, Paul talks about sin existing before the law. And what he means by that is the law is what's given on Mount Sinai. Right? And so the law is a diagnostic tool. Think of it like a doctor's test. Let's say there's a cancer that people have always had, and only recently they've discovered a diagnostic test for it. It doesn't mean people didn't have that cancer. It just meant now we can name it and talk about it, diagnose it. And so when God gives the people the law through Moses, the law becomes a diagnostic tool to reveal sin And in fact, it ends up sort of trapping us. And then we end up living under the dominion, which is really lordship. The word dominus in Latin for the Lord means being ruled over, right? And so Paul says, because of that first lust of the eyes and because the lust of the flesh of our first parents, both of them took that into themselves, this being ruled over by death and sin came into the world. But, he says, because of the good gift that came to us in Jesus, we have a different kind of dominion, and it's no longer the dominion of death and sin, but life and grace. What this means is the one who rules now is Jesus, right? Ruled by Jesus. This is why we say Jesus is Lord, because Jesus is the one who has lordship over us. Now here's what you have to think. What Paul is saying is the world in which we live is this world. This is the Good Friday world, as theologians sometimes like to say. The world in which you've been brought into through baptism as a Christian is this world, the world of Easter. And the difficult thing about being a Christian, living out Easter values in a Good Friday world, is the world does not recognize or care about life and grace. The world operates by the rules of death and sin. And so you have to realize this is the harder choice. If in fact Jesus is the Lord and he calls you to a particular way of life, to have dominion of life and grace means putting yourself at a certain kind of risk in a world that does not value that. But the reason we do that is if Jesus is Lord and if Easter is the new normal, the new reality, what other choice do we have? And so Paul is exhorting you in Romans chapter 5 to really think about living under the dominion of Easter. What would it mean if Easter ruled your life? And so this is a Lenten question too. We're not just focused on our sins. During Lent, we're asking ourselves, how do we kind of reorient our lives toward the light of Easter? It's reorienting our appetites, reorienting our gaze, putting ourselves in our proper place. All right, well, here's where we want to talk about the temptation in the wilderness, and we want to do it in conjunction with Revelation chapter 12 and 13. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is we're studying this right now in our class, so I just want to have some cross-germination. If you're not in our class, you can certainly read those chapters and get an idea of what I'm talking about. In Revelation chapter 12, we get the pregnant woman, and she's unnamed, so she's oftentimes seen as the new Eve, or certainly the Virgin Mary, and Mary and Eve are oftentimes associated. And we get the many-headed dragon. Now, the many-headed dragon is Satan. And the many-headed dragon in Revelation 12 tries to eat the baby that she's bearing. I mean, it's really a grotesque story, but it highlights the danger that evil would like to consume the newborn baby that is coming out of the womb of this cosmic Eve or the Virgin Mary. Now, what happens is the dragon is unsuccessful. So I want you to think in two terms. We can think on the cosmic plane, which is what Revelation is doing, and we can think on the historical plane. So historically, it's the idea that when Jesus is born, the many-headed dragon has his various beasts that are his servants. That's what we said in Revelation 13. And one of those beasts happens to be Herod. Now, I'm not saying in Revelation 13 we're not talking about Herod necessarily, but servants of the dragon, and Herod tries to slaughter the baby, right? So we have the slaughter of the innocents. We have the Holy Family leaving to Egypt. Now, what I mean by this is that this child who grows will encounter the dragon again. And so when we get to the temptation in the wilderness, it's not just like, okay, bring out the devil and we've got to do that thing. This is part of this cosmic unfolding that happened even at the beginning of Jesus' life, of now the child who is threatened is going to meet the dragon. And the dragon is going to try and tempt him away like he did in Genesis 3, and he's not going to be successful. And so Jesus successfully resisting the temptation in the wilderness is a major event and a sign that, in fact, God will make a faithful human being and we will be victorious over the forces of evil. So think about that first temptation. The temptation that the devil offers is the same one he offered in Genesis 3, a temptation of the eyes and the flesh. Jesus, your flesh is hungry. I bet you can see those stones would look pretty good as freshly baked loaves of bread. So stones into bread. I notice it is the exact same routine that worked in Genesis 3. The devil doesn't have to be creative in temptation because human beings are fairly predictable in how we react to certain things. And guess what? It doesn't work, right? Jesus resists. Jesus' hunger and the needs that he has do not overpower his gaze, which will be on the Father. So he looks beyond the bread and beyond his own hunger to the face of the one who has sent him. Which means the devil needs to really up his game now. So now here's where he takes him to the pinnacle of the temple. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second. And this is where he's going to tempt him to subvert God's will for his own. So this is where we get kind of a subversion of the mission. So if Jesus' own appetites aren't going to derail him, well, what if he wants to start dictating the mission back to God, subverting the mission? And so by subverting the mission, what I mean is rather than the angels of God attending him and caring for him as he's obedient to God's will, he now says, okay, angels, come and do what I want. I'm going to throw myself off this building and catch me as a kind of parlor trick. And Jesus refuses to do that because he knows that his role isn't to throw himself from the pinnacle of the temple. His role is to be obedient to the mission of the one who has sent him. Now this actually gives you one possible location of the pinnacle of the temple. The word pinnacle in Greek doesn't mean the highest place. So when we say pinnacle, it was probably one of the wings of the temple platform. Here's the southwestern one. It could have been the southeastern one. Either way, I mean, he would have killed himself if he'd thrown himself off this wall. Here's actually a picture of the Judean wilderness. So, when Satan's saying, gosh, look at those stones, they could really be turned into bread, you can imagine what Jesus was probably looking at. And now the devil has been unsuccessful, and this is where I think we have a little bit of desperation, because the devil was trying to seduce Jesus for his own glory. Jesus, you start calling the shots. Jesus, you start showing your power the way you want. But now the game is unmasked. The devil is unmasked. I really just want you to worship me, right? That's what the devil wants. Please worship me. And if you worship me, I will give you all of these things that I have under my dominion. Because of the dominion of sin, the devil feels like he has some things he can hand out, and Jesus refuses. This is such a powerful moment, because Jesus refuses, and what the devil's asking for is to be affirmed in the choice he's made, right? I want to be the center of the universe. I want people to worship me. And if the Son of God worships me, it affirms that I was right. And so one of the spiritual dangers we have that we have to attend to in Lent is that when we are involved in things that we should not, when we are complicit in evil, or when we are indulging sin, we oftentimes look for people who can say, no, that's okay. That's okay. And Jesus refuses to do that. Now, what we see then is after this third temptation, which is simply to transfer worship from God to the devil, Jesus is victorious. So here in this cosmic battle between the dragon and the son of the woman in Revelation 12 and 13, in these sort of pictures of apocalyptic monsters, we now see someone who's winning. We now see one who is victorious. And so this round has been won. And so when Paul talks about the dominion of life and grace and living into Easter, I mean, the reason we can do that is the one we are following has won the battle. And in fact, on the cross has won the war. And so that's why we have these significant images from Lent that we need to return to and kind of mine a little bit to kind of see what's at stake. The devil will return to tempt him again on the cross, to tempt him to despair, and to tempt him to faithlessness. But even there he will be victorious. So like I said, this is the battle, the cross is the war, and Jesus is the victor. All right, well, this has been a little longer than usual, but I hope you have some interesting things to think about, and we will see you on Sunday.